Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin Daf Yud. This week's learning is sponsored by Helen Danzak in loving memory of her mother, Lucille Flagler, on her 29th yahrzeit. The years fly past, and it still as if it's only been yesterday since I had a chance to visit. Mamala, may your neshama have an aliyah. This week's learning is sponsored by Petra, Tova, and Orly in honor of their mother, Wendy Proskin. Happy Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day to all those celebrating today. Okay, we're going to get started. We have it maybe isn't the most fascinating daf, but I want you to think about the background to what we're learning. And these are really, as I said in the other daf, that there's a lot of basics here about, right? Chullin, in the beginning, we've had some combination of, really some really inherently interesting topics from a different perspective. And now we're really getting into basics of kashrut. And here we're going to even talk about things that go far beyond kashrut, that really pervade many halakhic topics like chazaka, okay? And this is what we saw in Rav Chisda yesterday, and we're going to continue in that, about this idea of, Rav Chisda had two parts to what he said, and we're kind of in the middle of the second one, but then we're going to go back to the whole concept in general of how chazaka works. Okay, we're going to see today is a big machloket, Rav Chisda and Rav Huna, where Rav Huna is going to continue in one of the statements he made. And then we're going to end actually to find the source for how we know that you can rely on chazaka. Now, what is chazaka, just to be really clear, and maybe we can highlight it by reviewing what Rav Huna said yesterday, in yesterday's daf, which is this idea of a behema is behema b'chaya bechezkat isur. In animals, chazaka, the best, I guess, way to translate is presumptive status. I don't know if it's the same idea, but it's not the perfect translation. But we're going to say like this: something has a status. It's going to maintain its status quo until such time that we have reason to prove, or a way to prove that it changed. So when it comes to shechita is only going to permit the animal once we know that everything about the shechita was performed correctly. So what Rav Huna talked about was that the two simanim, right, the windpipe and the gullet, were severed. At least you need the majority of them to be severed. You have to check that. Otherwise, the presumptive status of that animal is not kosher. However, says Rav Huna, it goes in both directions, not just to be stringent. But once it's already slaughtered, and you know that it was slaughtered in a kosher manner, you don't have to worry that maybe the animal was a treifa if some suffix arrives. So let's go back to that case. He talked about the wolf. So the Gemara brought the case of the wolf, where you have a wolf that came after, so somebody slaughtered the animal. The slaughtering was done properly, but you always have to worry that maybe the animal was a treifa. And usually they do checks to make sure that there was nothing wrong with the animal after. But what if you didn't check and the innards got dragged away by a wolf? The wolf then brings them back, and you see it was nibbled away at a certain part. Do you have to worry that that wolf nibbled away at a part that already had a hole in it? Because if the innards had a hole when the animal was still alive, that would make the animal a treifa. And we said you don't have to worry about it. And we started comparing it. Why in leaving water, uncovered, would we have to be worried if maybe a snake came in? Or what if you're not sure if you left it uncovered? There we're going to be strict. And that's because it's danger, right? Physical danger, that you could die from it, as opposed to isur. And that was the big distinction that we made, even though Rav disagreed with that distinction, but everyone else seems to be supporting Rav Huna on this distinction. And that's what we're up to now with Rav Acha. So Rav Acha brings this braita. Okay, I forget now, is it a Tosefta or a braita? But right, maybe it's a Mishnah. Okay, he brings this source. Okay, right, Para Perik Yud Aleph. Okay, so it looks like, right, they say Mishnah of Shazeu Shebekan Braita. Okay, whatever. It's a source. It's a Braita, I guess. We have this flask. Okay, flask, jar, something like that. It was left. Okay, now we're going to have two cases. One where it was left uncovered, it came back covered. One where it was covered, and when we got back, in other words, what happened? We left it in one status and it changed. Something changed about it. So then we basically set up that if it was uncovered and became covered, we can assume a human touched it. Now, if we assume a human touches it, we make two assumptions. Number one, if it's now covered, it was done by human intervention. Number two, we can assume that person was impure. And then we say this water's impure. We're talking again about the mei chatat that they were going to use to make the para aduma waters with, where they mix it with ashes. Okay. The second case is it was left uncovered and is now, covered and it's now uncovered, the reverse. And there, we're not worried that it was a human who did it. We're actually concerned that a creature came in, okay? In the event that a creature could have come in or a dew could have come upon it, like it was outdoors, okay? So if that's the case, and without getting into all the details about exactly why, there's a big machloket why a chulder and a chash specifically, according to Rabbanit, that would mess it up, because they have to do what they spit stuff out, and the saliva will ruin it, or there's other options. Doesn't really matter for our purposes right now. But then, okay, so the first case, we're going to say a human, and then it's called, now the word has become impure because we're worried that someone impure touched it. If it's a snake and all that or the dew, that disqualifies the waters. Okay, these are two different things that happen. Either one is tamei, one is psula. Okay, the Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. That's where we're going to start now. The last line of Daf Tet. I'm a bet. Matam. What's the reason? Okay, why, if it's uncovered and now covered, we assume it was a human. Covered to uncovered, we assume it was a creature. That's pretty obvious. Because usually, right, when something gets uncovered, it's usually a creature. But creatures don't usually come and cover your uncovered, right, flask. It's not a very common thing that a creature will come and say, oh, that human left it uncovered, let's cover it for them. Okay, so we work on certain assumptions. Okay, now they say here, okay, we're going to skip the words inami. It doesn't really make so much sense here. Some people take out these words entirely, but we're going to read them. Okay, so this whole reason here all based on, right, it was uncovered, then covered, covered, then uncovered. But now what if you just came back and it was exactly as you left it? Okay, now theoretically, a creature could have come in. Theoretically, right, a human could have touched it. But it sounds like lo tumeika v'lo psuleika. We don't call it impure. We don't call it disqualified. So what do you see here? That we're lenient here, because what's the assumption? The assumption is the water was kosher when we left it, and we keep the presumptive status. So what do you see here? When it comes to iser veheter, right? Can we use these waters or assume something disqualified? We actually don't worry about it. Okay, when there's less reason, right? In this case, we're not going to worry about it. Ve'ilu safek mayim megulim asulim. But again, going back to the water, right, for drinking purposes, right? This is not for drinking purposes. There's no fear anyone's going to die from it, because that's not what we're worried about. Here, for drinking purposes, we're going to be machmir. Shma mina, right? Where you're not sure if it was left uncovered. You can't just say, oh, probably a snake didn't come in and we could drink the water. But when it comes to paradunal waters, if nothing changed, there's no reason to think that a snake got in there. If a snake got in, it would have been, would have changed from covered to uncovered. Okay? Shma mina, chamir sakanta meisur shma mina. So what do you infer from here? It's more chamor. Isur is less, right? We're going to be more chamor about sakana than we are going to be about isur veheter, about prohibitions. And therefore, again, we're back to supporting what Rav Huna said. Now, just because we got on this topic of leaving water uncovered, we're going to mention, we're going to bring up a Mishnah in Truma where it talks about this. Okay, we don't think that a snake puts its venom in just any liquid, specifically mayim v'yayin b'chalav, water, wine, and milk. Now, the idea here is that if I leave uncovered water and I walk out of the room, there's a concern that a snake put its venom in there. Now, the question is, how long do I need to have left the room for there to be concern about this? So there's a pretty obvious answer. We're worried, we have to figure out the amount of time it would take for this creature, the snake, to come out from somewhere nearby. Now remember, their ground, right? It was like their floors weren't like tiled floors, right? It was soil. So creatures could come up from their floor, from right nearby, and drink. So the Gemara asks kind of funny question. Oh, first they say, "V'kama makom karov." Okay, how close by? Rav Yitzchak, Rav Yehuda, kadesh yitzei mitachat ozen kli v'yishteh. So they say the amount of time it would take for the snake to come from under the ground, right where the vessel is. This is not a lot of time. Come out from under the handle. The ozen is the handle of the kli, right? Ozen is an ear, but right, you can imagine why they call it an ozen. It looks like almost like an ear. So come out from under the handle of the vessel, and go into it and drink. So here's the funny question. Wait a minute. That's not the right amount of time, because if I walk out of the room and there's exactly enough time for the snake to come out of the ground, go in, drink the water into the cup, go drink the water, and then I walk into the room, I will see the snake. So we aren't worried about that amount of time, because in that amount of time, if I walk back into the room, I'll see the snake there. And if I don't see a snake there, well, then there's not enough time, right? That wasn't enough time for the snake to get there and disappear. So basically, we're going to have to add the disappearing part. Okay, what we mean is there has to be enough time. Okay, I don't know if this is seconds, a minute, right, for the snake to come out of the ground right where the cup is, or flask, or whatever it is, come out from under the handle, get in, drink, come back out, and go into its hole. So the amount of time that would take is the exact amount of time that if I left the room and didn't pay attention, or I turned around, wasn't looking, that could transpire. Okay, that was an aside about that. Now we're going to go back to our main issue, which is we're talking about shechita. And if you remember, Rav Huna made two statements. Right now we're going to focus on the first. Rav Huna said, it all started because what did Shmuel? They quoted in the name of Shmuel that the tabach needs to check the simanim after shechita to make sure that you cut through the majority of the two simanim. That's how kosher is. That's how an animal is slaughtered is kosher. You did the majority of both simanim. Okay, the windpipe and the gullet. In a bird, it's the majority of one siman. Okay, it's different in a bird than it is for the animal. But now, and then what did Rav Huna say? That if you didn't check, right? So Shmuel said you have to check. And Rav Huna said, if you don't check, well, the animal's still not kosher, because unless you know for sure the shechita was done properly, it stays in its presumptive status of prohibited. So Itmar, what if another issue comes up now? And Rav Huna is going to be exactly in the same mindset as he was before, which makes sense. Remember, you can't slaughter with a knife that has nicks in it. That's why the slaugterers always check before they start their day of work. They check that their knife has no nicks in it. Now, you check that your knife had no nicks. In fact, you're supposed to show it to a chacham before, out of respect for the chacham. We'll get back to that again today. But you slaughter with a knife, and then after, sometime later in the day, you happen to notice, so your knife was fine in the morning, and you happen to notice later, it's pguma. Okay, let's say right after even. Okay, you find it has a nick. Now remember, if it has a nick, what's the problem? We're worried that when you're slaughtering, you're actually going to cause the animal to be a treifa before you actually slaughter the animal, and then it's not going to be a kosher animal. So Amar Rav Huna, afilu shiber ba'atzamot kol hayom, even if you used it for cutting bones. Now, cutting bones is obviously more severe than slaughtering the animal. Okay, cutting bones is more severe, more harsh on the knife, and more likely to cause nicks. So if I slaughtered the animal in the morning, continue to cut bones with the same knife, chayshinan shema ba'or nifgema. It's still going to, I didn't go back to the word even though I read it, psula. We're going to retroactively say that the slaughter you did in the morning with this knife is disqualified. Why? Chayshinan shema ba'or nifgema. It could be that as you were slaughtering that animal, first the knife, before it hits anything, it hits the hide of the animal. Maybe it got, before you even slaughtered the animal, maybe it got a nick already then, which means that when you continued to do it, you trafed the animal up, you made it a treifa before you finished slaughtering. So there's a concern. Now, why does this fit in with Rav Huna exactly? Because he said, until you know the shechita was done properly, and now you have a reason to think maybe the shechita wasn't done properly because your knife is not good. And we don't know when your knife became not good. We know, right? These are like a detective thing. We know at this hour in the morning it was fine. But we know that later it wasn't fine. And we have no idea at what point. And because we have presumptive status of not kosher until proven it was slaughtered properly, we don't know if it was slaughtered properly. It could have gotten ruined in the beginning of the first slaughter before it was actually done. Rav Chisda amar kshera, shema be'etzim nifkema. Rav Chisda says, what do you mean? It's kshera, because maybe it got ruined by the bone. Now, even if it was the bone on the first animal, let's say you're slaughtering and you cut the two simanim, you continue to cut, and you cut through the neck, right, the back of the neck, you could more likely, comes Rav Chisda and says that it got a nick on the way into the bone. after the slaughter was completed. So your slaughter is completely fine. Bishlama Rav Huna Kishmati. So now let's understand. Rav Huna makes perfect sense because it fits with what he said. We're going to assume presumptive status of not kosher until proven that you slaughtered it properly. You don't have good proof now because your knife, in the end, had a nick, and we don't know when it got the nick. Ela Rav Chisda my time up. But how does Rav Chisda matir this? How does he permit the meat? Amar lecha etzem vadai pogem, or safek pogem, safek lo pogem. This is what I call a statistical game. He says bones generally cause nicks and knives. He calls it vadai. It's hard to say it's vadai. We don't know for sure that the bone caused, when it hit the bone, it caused the nick, but bones generally cause nicks and knives, and cutting through the hide doesn't usually cause a nick in the hide. It's only a doubt. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But it's much more likely, if it hit the bone, that the bone caused the nick. So have a safek uvadai. So we have on the one hand a safek, maybe the hide, maybe not. But we have a vadai on the other hand, which is if it hit the bone, then wow, likely the bone caused the nick. And we don't let a safek scenario remove a vadai, a clear scenario. So since the likelihood is that it was from the bone, we're going to say the shechita was fine. We're now going to have two difficulties raised on Rav Chisda's position. Mativ Rava l'siyur l'Rav Huna. So Rava raises a difficulty, which is also a support for Rav Huna, because obviously if it's a difficulty on Rav Chisda, it's going to be a support for Rav Huna, from a case of a person going to the mikvah. Taval ve'ala v'nimtza alav davar chotzetz. Okay, you go in the mikvah, you get out of the mikvah, and later in the day you find something on your body, like some cake of mud stuck on, your skin somewhere, or something that would basically be called a chatzitza. It's something you want to remove. It's on your body, and you have to be in the mikvah without any sort of interposition here. So you find this thing, but you have no idea when it was there. Was it there in the mikvah when you went 2 hours ago, or did it happen later? Even if you were, let's say, dealing with some dirty material all day long, meaning after your mikvah, lo altalo tefillah. This doesn't work. Your tefillah was no good. Ad shiomar barili shelo haya alai kodem lechem. Unless you say, I know I checked my body. I know this was not here before. If you can't say that, your tefillah doesn't work. So, divadai taval. Now, why is this a difficulty with Rav Chisda? Because we know what's for sure. We know you went to the mikvah. What's the safek? Safek hava ale, safek lo hava ale. We don't know, was it on you, was it not on you? V'ka'ate safek umotzimi devadai. So here what happens, halachically, the safek situation, which is, we don't know when this got on my body, when it didn't, overrides what we know for sure, which is you went to the mikvah. So here we seem to have a difficulty with Rav Chisda, but now we're going to start distinguishing. Shanei hatam. Now we're going to start distinguishing, but every time we make a distinction to resolve the difficulty, we're going to say, but that same distinction applies in the other case as well. So if, as I'm saying, you say, but that would also apply there, don't worry, the Gemara is going to say that as well. So what are they going to say here? Shanei hatam di'ikala meimar ha'amed tameh al chizkato ve'ema lo taval. Well, you could say this person started out with presumptive status of impure. So keep the person in their status quo. Don't change it unless you know for sure. So that's why in the tefillah case, the tefillah doesn't work. Because if you go back, if you have a safek, go back to the status quo. Okay, they say, wait a minute. It would be the same thing with the animal. Hachanami, what did Rav Chisda say in the animal? The animal's okay because you can assume, right, that the knife got messed up later. But he doesn't say that in the tefillah case. In the tefillah case, right, everyone would agree, right? Because doesn't disagree here. There's a Tanaitic source. In the tefillah case would be otherwise. So we tried to say in the tefillah case that's because there's a chizkat tum'ah. Obviously, you're now going to say in the animal case there's a chizkat not kasher until proven otherwise. So hachanami, ha'mei be'ema chizkato. If you're going to say there's a safek, say the animal's in its original, keeps its status quo. What was its status quo? Emer lo nishchata. We should say it wasn't slaughtered. So why? In the animal case, are we lenient? And in the tefillah case, we're stringent. That's really not a good distinction. They say, no, haresh chuta lefanecha. But in the shechita case, it's slaughtered. So it's already slaughtered. The two simanim are completely severed or mostly. And you see the animal slaughtered. That's why we allow it. They say, Okay, also in the tefillah case, hachanami arei taval lefanecha. The person has dunked. They're clearly dunked in the mikvah. Should be fine. So we're still back to saying we're going to have a little more back and forth to try to say what are the differences and say that's not a real difference. They say, no. It's true the person toveled, but but there's a big, warning sign here. There's a chatzitza on the person's body. So it's very nice the person went in the mikvah, but there's a chatzitza which we see with our own eyes. What do you mean? It's the same problem with the shechita. You say the animal was in its presumptive status of forbidden, and yet Rav Chisda permits it, even though we have in front of our eyes a knife with nicks. So we basically said you can't distinguish at this point because they're both the same, right? Both of them. Let's just review before we get to the final answer of Rav Chisda. Okay, again, here are the facts. The tefillah case, we have a suffix. Was the chatzitza on before or after? We're stringent. We say you're still tameh. The shechita case, we say, even though we found a nick in the knife, we assume the shechita was done properly and the nick came later. Now, they're both cases where we have presumptive status of something that we're now changing, right? Presumptive status of tameh, presumptive status of isser. When it comes to the animal, we're going to permit it. When it comes to the tefillah, we're going to say no. It's not permitted, even though both of them, the action was done, but there's a doubt about them. So what's the difference? We're going to end this section with sakin itrai behema lo itrai. What's the difference? An interesting difference. In the animal case, where's the suffix? Not in the animal itself, but in the knife. In other words, where's the reyuta? Where's the problematic thing that we see? It's true we see a nick in the knife, but it's in the knife, not in the animal. If you go back to the case of the tefillah, there's a chatzitza on the person. And since we're talking about the presumptive status of the person and the animal, since the animal looks completely slaughtered, and it's just that we don't know was the knife, did the knife have a nick, we're going to distinguish. Okay, and that's why, again, Rav Huna doesn't think so. Rav Huna thinks chazaka, we go by chazaka, presumptive status. In both cases, we're going to be strict here. But according to Rav Chisda, okay, that was Rav Huna, according to Rav Chisda, we can be made lenient in the case of the animal because the question that is raised here, there's definitely an animal slaughtered. It's just a question. Was the knife, did it have a nick and then maybe cause the animal to be a treifa when we slaughtered it? But since it wasn't in the animal itself, in other words, the nick that we see, we're going to be lenient. That's his reason. Okay, so now we're going to say, and it's not his reason, it's how he distinguishes between his case. His reason is very clear. Safek or vaday ain't safek motzimi de vaday. We definitely know that bones cause nicks. The hide causing a nick is quite unlikely, and I would say kind of it's a statistical game. The likelihood of it happening from the before the slaughter is very unlikely, and that's why we're going to allow this. If it was something that was on the animal itself, that would be a different story, it sounds like. So now we're going to go to question number 2. We're going to actually answer it in the same manner. Meitive. Shachata taveshet. Now they're getting into a different case. This is a Tanaic source that talks about the following. Shachata taveshet, v'achar kach nishmitar gargeret. We're talking about a bird. Now, what I told you about a bird before, whether you paid attention or not, I don't know. But a bird, all you have to do is cut one siman, not both. So we're going to talk about the veshet and the gargeret. Those are the two parts in the bird that you have to cut. But only one of them, and it could be either one. What if shachata taveshet, you cut the windpipe, v'achar kach nishmitar gargeret, and then the gargeret comes out of its place, the second siman. Kshera, it's fine because you cut one, totally fine. This is just the background. Nishmitar gargeret, v'achar kach shachata taveshet psula. But if first the gargeret came out of its place, that would make the animal a treifa. So if you then slaughtered it later, that wouldn't work. Okay, too late. So it's disqualified. It's not a good shechita. What if shachata taveshet? What if you cut the veshet, the windpipe, and then nimtze tar gargeret shmuta? Okay, now the gullet is out of its place, but you don't know when it got out of its place. Okay, based on what we just learned, it all depends. Was it before you cut the first siman or after? So if you don't know, because you only found that it was displaced after you slaughtered the animal, but eino yodea im kodem shechita nishmita im la'achar shmita nishmita, but you don't know what happened. This is a very similar case, right? We have a kosher slaughter, but we don't know, was it really kosher or not? Because did something precede it, right? Was it actually removed from its place before you slaughtered it or not? Zehaya Maseh. So the Tannaitic source continues and says there was a case like this. Ve'amru, and what did they say? Kol safek b'shchita pasul. If you have a safek about whether the shechita was done properly, okay, whether the second siman was out of its place before you cut the first siman or after, it's pasul. Now, instead of saying this case is pasul, they said, and the Braita says this, kol safek b'shchita pasul. Any safek about it. They made a general principle from here. So the question is, kol safek b'shchita latu yemai. What is this coming to include if not our case? Lav latu, is it not to include ki agavna, our case? Where, again, what was our case? You slaughter the animal, then you find, right, you check the knife, it was fine. You slaughter it, you find a nick in your knife after. That would be also a safek in shechita. It's exactly what we have here. And what does it say? Any safek in shechita is psula. Is it not to include our case? Against Rav Chisda, because Rav Chisda says it's fine because we can assume it was done by the bone after at the end of the shechita. To which they say, lo, to answer the question, they suggest maybe it's not coming to exclude our case. La tuye safek shaha safek daras. Maybe it's to include a case where there's a safek about whether, for some reason, they're not sure. Did the person wait in between the two simanim? Did they chop it, directly rather than the back and forth motion, okay, or any of those five psulim? Maybe that's the case of doubt that they were talking about, that any doubt of that is going to be disqualified. Turning now to Amud Bet. Now they have to ask, though, Maishna, what's the difference between that safek and our safek? They're both safekot about, right? Was the knife, did it have a nick or not? And did you make it a treifa before? Or did you wait and ruin it? What's the difference? And again, we're going to get back to the same answer. What's the difference? Here, the safek is in the knife, not in the animal itself. Safek shaha, safek daras, that's a problem in the animal itself. Did you wait in between cutting the two simanim? Did you smash the knife into the animal or not? So that's a different problem. That's a problem in the shechita, right? In the animal itself. Was there a problem in the animal, as opposed to a safek about the knife, right? Where the object, where there's a safek about, is the knife. Now, obviously, it then affects how the animal was slaughtered, but it's a different object where the safek is about when did the nick happen, as opposed to did you slaughter it like this or did you slaughter it like that, where it's directly about the animal itself. And therefore, in the end, we prove Rav Chisda against, and we didn't prove he's right, but what we did was, right, because just to review, Rav Huna has this approach, until you know for sure, we're not going to get that animal out of its presumptive status of not being edible, basically, because when it's alive, it's not edible. And until there's a kosher slaughter, and we know for sure the slaughter was kosher, we're not going to allow it. So there's a safek about the nick and the knife, no way, no how. Rav Chisda, who says, no, we're not worried about a nick in the knife, even though we would be worried about other kind of similar situations, because that's when it's in it would be if the comparison, if we take the tefillah case, or the other case, which we don't even need to make a parallel, which is when there's something about the animal itself, and then we're going to be stringent. But if it's a safek about when this nick got into the knife, we're not going to be stringent, and we're going to go by what the chances are, right? What is more likely that happened, which is more likely the bone ruined it, and the bone you get to only after, at the end of the slaughter, once it's already done properly. Now we're going to have some rulings about this. Who do we hold like? The hilchata kavatei de Rav Huna kishish lo shibar ba'etzem. The hilchata kavatei de Rav Chisda kishish shibar ba'etzem. If you broke a bone, then we're going to hold like Rav Chisda, and we're going to say, right. When you, I should have said the first one first. We're going to hold like Rav Huna when you didn't break a bone. Okay, if you didn't break any bones, then we have to assume it happened at the beginning. And then we're going to passel the animal and say this is not a good slaughter. But if you broke bones, then we're going to hold like Rav Chisda. So now the Gemara has a little bit of a problem with this psikah, because it says, wait a minute. Michlal de Rav Chisda afagav de lo shiber ba'etzem ela b'mai ipkim. Wait a minute. Wasn't Rav Chisda's whole theory that it's more likely that it got a nick from breaking the bone than it is from tearing the hide? But if you didn't break any bone, and we know you didn't break any bone, then how could you possibly say it was from the bone and not from the hide? You didn't break a bone. So that doesn't make any sense. And you have to understand, when they say the halacha is like him in this case, and the halacha is like him in this case, that means, well, they disagree in the other cases as well. But how could they disagree if there was no bone? If we say we hold like Rav Huna in the case where, if we hold like Rav Chisda in a place where you broke a bone, right? But we don't hold like him in a case where you didn't break a bone, but where you didn't break a bone, he doesn't even disagree. Right? It wouldn't make sense he would disagree. So what did they answer? Now we're going to say there's actually 3 stages. Okay, we talked about it either gets a nick from tearing the hide, or it gets a nick if you broke a bone. Now we're going to learn that even if you didn't break a bone, it still could have gotten a nick from the bone. What is that? From the mafreket. What's the mafreket? It's the back, the bone in the back of the neck. Now, when you're slaughtering an animal, so first you're going to cut the hide, tear the hide, then your knife is going to hit the 2 simanim, and if you continue going through and completely sever them, your knife will hit into the bone. Now, it might not break the bone, but it might hit into the back of the bone, the bone in the back of the neck. So what Rav Chisda is saying is, even if your knife hit the bone, not cut it, not broke it, but hitting it only, right, touching it, that might have caused the nick, and that's why we're going to be lenient. Now, we don't hold like him in that case, but he does disagree in that case, okay? And that's what we're going to say. So if it just hit the bone, we actually are not going to be lenient, but Rav Chisda himself would have been lenient. And that's why the statement actually makes sense, that we're going to hold like Rav Huna when you didn't break a bone, just you hit a bone, okay? And then Rav Chisda will disagree, and we don't hold like him. Now we're going to have some cases that happen, and we're going to try to figure out, was the ruling like Rav Chisda, or was the ruling like Rav Huna? Hava uvda utraf Rav Yosef ad tleisar chevata. There was a case where someone slaughtered animal after animal after animal. Sounds like 13 of them. And Rav Yosef said 13 of these animals were treifas. Okay, because what happened was at the end of the day, right, the slaughterer found a nick in the knife, and then we had to retroactively cancel all the slaughters. So this sounds obviously kiman, ki Rav Huna, va'afilu b'kamaita. It sounds like it's Rav Huna who said, when you find the nick, you have to assume it happened from tearing the hide in the first animal, and therefore 1 to 13 are all disqualified. To which they say, not necessarily. You could also say this is Rav Chisda. Why? And now they're going to add something that we didn't really think about yet, which is lo, ki Rav Chisda ulevar mikamaita. Now, Rav Chisda said that if you find the knife is disqualified after you slaughtered, you're going to say that the one you just did probably happened at the end of that slaughter when it hit the bone, and therefore your shechita is fine. But what if you didn't check the knife after you did? And let's say in this case, we're going to have to assume there were 14 animals. There were 14 animals. Now, when does Rav Chisda think that the knife could have gotten a nick? Actually, it's possible. If it's all from the bone, it's possible it got a nick from the first time you did the slaughter. So the first one is good. That's what it says, levar mikamaita, other than the first. The first one is good, but you can assume the nick happened after the first slaughter, which means the slaughters 2, 3, 4, 5 until 14 are all problematic. And that's why you disqualified 13 out of 14. Okay, so now the Gemara basically suggested it's either Rav Huna or it's Rav Chisda, and then it's just a matter of, was the first animal included in what was ruined, what was deemed not kosher, or only from the second one on? But now they suggest a different reading. Maybe there is no deliberation. Maybe you say for sure it's Rav Huna, because now, this is something I wanted to mention earlier, but I forgot to, which is Rav Chisda's whole law is premised on, right? Since there's statistics operating here, but it's not just statistics. It's this principle in halacha we use that's called tolim. Tolim means we can assume, we can make an assumption if we have something else to rely on, that it came from somewhere else, okay? Then we can assume that that's what happened, okay? It's cases where they allow certain leniencies, and we say we can allow this to happen. Now, if we use this principle of tolim, okay, so Ikar Rav Chisda michte mitzla talinan, since we can say, oh, let's assume it happened from the bone and not the hide, who's to say it was the first one that it got ruined by? Maybe it's only from the last animal. And maybe if you hold like Rav Chisda, now we don't know. We don't know how far Rav Chisda takes this. Is it that we assume it was done by the bone, and then you'd have to say, because that's more vadai, and then you'd have to go with, it was obviously then you have to rely on that it was the first one. But if we're saying that, who knows, hide, bone, maybe bone of the last one, maybe bone of the first, maybe the fifth, maybe we can just go with, maybe it was only the last. You can assume, you can kind of, litzlot is to hang it on. So you wouldn't say this in English, literally, we can hang it on that, but that's what they're saying. Hebrew, it works better. You say, tolim, that this was what happened. And then you can assume that it was the last one. And then actually none of them are a problem. So then the only way to explain this stringent ruling of Rav Yosef is to say he held like Rav Huna. Amalei Rav Acha, berei derive le Rav Ashi, and I saw someone just wrote this in the chat. So as a result of what we've been discussing, Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Rav Ashi, Rav Kahana, he said, I know Rav Kahana, masrich b'dikuta bein kol chada v'chada. He required the knife be checked between every shechita. So now again, this is another ruling, and we're now going to say, so the first ruling was Rav Yosef, who said 13 animals were a treifa. At first we didn't know, maybe it's Rav Huna, maybe Rav Chisda. The second reading was, again, different possible reading. We don't know which is right. Maybe you can't really say it's Rav Chisda, because he would have said, assume it's the last. Now we have another thing, which is this ruling of Rav Kahana, that he basically insisted everyone in his community probably, right, like all the shochtim, would check between every slaughter to prevent issues here. Now, to prevent what issues? So Kiman, ki Rav Huna ula mifsal kamaita. He must have been saying, like Rav Huna, and what he wanted to say is, if you find a nick, we're going to retroactively disqualify your shechita that you did already. To which the Gemara obviously says, lo, ki Rav Chisda. What do you mean? You can explain it like Rav Chisda. Ula achshure batriyata. Your first one for sure is going to be fine, but in order to make sure that your subsequent conversions during your subsequent slaughters during the day are good, we're basically going to require you to check your knife so that you know that every subsequent slaughter is good, but not retroactively. So again, it's not clear who he holds like. So they say, wait a minute. If you think it's Rav Chisda, and it's to make sure that your subsequent slaughters are good, yihachi tibai nami b'dikat chacham. Well, in the beginning of the day, when you start slaughtering, you have to have your knife checked by a chacham. So why don't we make you check between, if the whole issue is we're not worried about retroactive, but we're worried about moving forward, then it should be no different than checking your knife in the morning. If you have to check your knife before you start slaughtering by a chacham, by someone who's knowledgeable, then you should have to check it in between each one. If you're saying it's because Rav Chisda and it's moving forward, then you would have to check each one. So they say, no, Eidecha ne'eman b'isurim. This is a very big line. Okay, there's a lot said about this, but we don't have so much time to go into it. But one witness is believed in the world of Isurim. When is one witness not believed in? We always say you need two witnesses. What do you need two witnesses for? For judgments, right? For giving someone lashes, for arayot, if it's improper relations, or mamonot, right? For dine mamonot, if you want to have move money, right? Say this person stole from someone else, you need two witnesses. Obviously, for the death penalty, you need two witnesses, because al pishne edim yakum davar, there's all these drashot about davar, how do we get davar mi'erva, and all that. Okay, but when it comes to, for example, kashrut, how do you know when you can eat in somebody's house, right? If someone is shomer mitzvot, they keep mitzvot, then you can rely on them to tell you, right? Why shomer mitzvot? Because to be an aid, you have to be shomer mitzvot. So if you're shomer mitzvot, then you observe commandments, then basically if they say, I keep kosher in my house, you can believe them, and you can eat in their house, because you can assume that they're not lying about it. That's exactly this principle. We're using it here with shechita. The shochet can say, I know I checked the knife and he's believed. So we don't need more than that. We don't need the chacham. Okay. So right now we said, fine. So if it's Rav Chisda, you don't need the chacham, even if you're moving forward, because you can believe the shochet that it didn't have a nick. Okay, well then, so then why do you need the chacham in the first place, in the beginning of your day, before you start slaughtering? Say that, that's just to show respect for the chacham. That's a different law entirely. You don't really need it. Okay, the whole idea is they wanted the chacham to have respect within the community. They told the shoftim to have their knives checked by the chacham. But you don't really need it from a halachic perspective. So that resolves that issue. Again, how do we explain this? We basically, why did we get here? Because we basically said the fact that Rav Kahana said you need to check the knife in between could either go like Rav Huna to check your previous shechita and maybe disqualify that if you find the nick, or to say Rav Chisda, we're worried about your next slaughter. Okay, and the chacham issue is an irrelevant one. Now we go to this basic question, which is, what is the source? Manaha milta, where do we get this? De amar rabbanan oke milta achezke, which is a very basic principle, chazaka. How do we know this issue of presumptive status? Well, Rav Huna talked about, which again, was lechula, lekula, and lechumra. He said it in both directions, right? When it starts off presumptive status of not kosher, it's not kosher till we know for sure the shechita was done properly. But once the shechita is done properly, we assume it's kosher unless we know otherwise, that there's proof that it was a treif. Okay, like in a case where you can't check it and some animal took off took out some of the parts of the body, we don't have a way to check them, we can assume it was fine. So where do we get this from? Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonatan Amar Kra. We're going to learn it from a very interesting place. V'yatsa kohen min habayit al petach habayit. We're talking about leprosy of the house. So what happens? The kohen goes, he checks you have a leprous mark. If he determines that the size is exactly the right size, that's a size that's going to make it problematic, it has all the criteria of all the things that make it leprous mark, what the Kohen's going to do is he's going to do what's called lasgir et habayit. He's going to close the house, like lisgor tadelet, closes up the house. We call it quarantining, quarantines the house, but it's called to close up the house. Now, so what happens? Now, then he comes back a week later and he sees if the size got smaller, right? He has to check how it changed from the size it was then to what it is now, what it looks like, and then we'll determine if the house is fixed, okay? And then there's all these rules what you do. I'm not going to get into that. But it says here, the Kohen yatsa, pay attention to the words, yatsa, he leaves the house, min habayit, he goes out from the house, el petach habayit, to the entrance of the house, vizgir habayit shivat yamim, and he quarantines the house for 7 days. Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, they say like this. This proves presumptive status. Why? Well, when you leave the house, what do? You turn around, right? So the Kohen looks, finds the nega, turns around and walks out the door. Now, until he gets out the door, some time elapses between the time he starts turning around to get out the door, closes the door, and quarantines the house. Maybe bitsar le'shiura, maybe the leprous mark got a little bit smaller. Now, if the leprous mark is not exactly the right size and is smaller than that, then there's no real quarantine of the house because it wasn't really a leprous mark. So if he's not looking the whole time, maybe it changed. So what does this prove? It's, again, a very strange way to prove this. It must be that as soon as the Kohen sees it, it retains its presumptive status of leprous until proven otherwise. So if the Kohen doesn't see it, it doesn't really matter because as long as it's still presumptive status, it's presumptive status, okay? We assume it's there. And that way, even though 2 minutes may elapse from the time the Kohen leaves to go quarantine the house, turns around, isn't looking anymore, if the leprous mark changes, it doesn't matter because the leprous mark stays with its chazaka. Okay, Matkiv la Rav Acha, he says, what are you talking about? This doesn't prove anything. Maybe he walks out backwards so that he can be looking at the leprous mark the whole time. He has his eyes on it until he gets out the door and then he quarantines the house. There's no time that elapses. So Rabbi says, I got 2 responses to you. Number 1, when we say go out is the standard way of going out. Nobody goes out walking backwards. That's not a normal way of going out. So obviously the Kohen turns around. Even if the Kohen was walking backwards, let's say the leprous mark is behind the door. Kohen's not going to see that as he goes out. It's going to be hidden by the door being open and he won't be able to see it. Now, if you want to respond to that question by saying, maybe he opens a window near that leprous mark, so when he's outside and quarantining the house, he could still see inside to that part behind the door. Let's say it's behind the door. If you have a very dark house with no windows, you don't open windows to see the nega. You just don't, the house won't become a nega tzarat because you don't open windows to look at nig'ei tzarat, okay, the leprous marks. So that's Abai's response to this difficulty of Rav Acha, but comes Rava to support this question of Rav Acha, and he says, he's going to basically have 2 retorts to the 2 retorts of Abai. You said when it says to go out, it never means walk backwards. That's not true. Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim yochiach. The Kohen Gadol in Yom Kippur, when he goes into the Kodesh Kodashim, dechtiv beyitzia, it says, v'yatsa v'asat olato. He goes out of the Kodesh Kodashim. And what does the Mishnah say? How does he go out? Do you remember this? Utnan yatsa ubalo derek knisato. He goes the way he came, meaning he walks out backwards, like the way people go at the kotel, right? So same way, that's where it comes from. from the Kohen Gadol who leaves the Kodesh Kodeshim walking backwards. And it says yatzan, it means going out backwards. So you could say the same thing in the leper's house. And and you say, well, what about the dark house? Well, that's a dark house. That's a place where there was no neged sarat because you never determined there was. But in our case, where it had already, the Kohen saw the nega, just to maintain his eye contact on it, theoretically, you can open a window. So we're back to saying this doesn't prove anything about presumptive status because theoretically, the Kohen might have to watch this the entire time, and that doesn't prove anything. Now we're going to bring a braita that's not like Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, like this difficulty, and we're going to bring a braita that supports our original claim. You can prove it from here. Because it says, Tanya de lo ki Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, and then we're going to end with Rav Acha's retort to it, okay, or what he could say. V'yatza, to support his going against this source. And then we're left with, maybe this is a source, maybe it's not. And with that, we'll finish. V'yatza kohen min habayit. Yachol yelech lebeito v'yazkil. You might think he could go to his house in between and then quarantine the house. In other words, it says you go out. Maybe he could go out, go home, come back 5 minutes later, an hour later, and quarantine the house. So, Talmud Lomar, al petach habayit. No, because it says he goes out to the petach habayit. He doesn't go out to his house. He goes out to the entrance to the house. He can't go home. Well, it says petach habayit sounds like maybe he has to be exactly in the doorpost. Talmud Lomar, min habayit. No, it says he leaves from the house, which means he's away from the house. He has to be completely out of the house, including the doorpost. So how does he do it? This isn't yet relevant. He stands next to the doorpost, and that's where he does the quarantining from. But now, you ready for this? Now, if he went home in between, you're not supposed to, but let's say the Kohen anyway did. Went home, needs to go to the bathroom, I don't know, he went home, comes back, and wants to quarantine the house. Or was standing in the house. Okay, that's not really relevant for us. Vizgir, and then he quarantines it. It actually works. Talmud Lomar, how do you know that? Vizgir tabayit mikom makom. Because it says he quarantines the house no matter what. So that teaches you that post facto, if he happened to go home, even though he shouldn't, it's fine. Well, then he's obviously not watching the house the whole time, and yet that proves them presumptive status. Okay? But here's Rav Acha's response. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, what would he say? The only way it would work if the Kohen went to his house would be if there's a row of people, and basically the first one sees the house, he tells the second tells the third, all the way back. They have like an assembly line here, all the way back to the Kohen, and that's the only way the Kohen can go, let's say, to the bathroom if he wanted in his house before he quarantines the house, as long as somebody's watching. So in the end, Rav Acha can still explain this source to say, you can't prove presumptive status from a leper's house, because it could be you really have to be watching it the whole time. Whereas the other approach is to say, no, you don't have to be watching it the whole time, and that proves that it retains its presumptive status, even though some time lapses in between that and that. Okay, and with that, we finish our discussion. Like I said, there's interesting topics we discussed today about chazaka, how chazaka works. When there's statistical, right, we're going to get to famous sugya tomorrow of the 9 stores, okay, and the kosher meat and all that. So that's going to be a sugya we've seen a bunch of times already. It comes up here as well. This is really the rov, chazaka, all those issues. So we started with the Rav Ashi trying to prove we're going to make the distinction between Isser and Sakana. Okay, we got a little bit off a tangent about Giloy and the whole thing about the snakes and what we're worried about. From there, we got to this machloket, Rav Huna, Rav Chisda, which we spent most of the daf on, about when the knife has a nick after the slaughter. Do we retroactively or only moving forward? Okay, and we saw the different sides to, right, do we go by statistics or do we go by chazaka? Okay, that's the real big pull today in those 2 directions. And then we wanted to find it, and then we had 2 difficulties on Rav Chisda. We then had 2 psikot, like rulings, and then we tried to say, well, maybe it seems obvious it's Rav Huna, and then said, maybe you could explain it like Rav Chisda as well. And then we got to what's the source for chazaka. We brought a source, but we're left with a little bit of lack of clarity because Rav Acha didn't think it was a good source to prove it. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a Shavua Tov.